There is a vine that breaks every rule we were taught about farming. It produces 3 times more protein than potatoes. It feeds itself by pulling nitrogen from thin air. And once you plant it, you never buy seed again. It returns every spring, forever. For thousands of years, it kept entire nations alive. It saved the Pilgrims from starvation during their first brutal winter. It fed the feast we now call Thanksgiving. Then we erased it. We didn't stop growing it because it failed. We stopped growing it because it succeeded without permission. A crop that feeds without cost, that heals soil instead of draining it, that spreads like a gift through the earth. It cannot be owned, and what cannot be owned cannot be sold. This is the story of the fourth sister, the one they left out of every textbook, the one that waited underground while we forgot her name. The archive opens along the eastern woodlands of North America, sometime around 3000 BCE. Long before Europeans arrived, indigenous farmers cultivated a climbing vine that produced something extraordinary. Not one tuber, but a string of them. 5, 10, 15 knobby beads connected like pearls on an underground thread. Pull up a single plant, and you would find a necklace of protein buried in the soil. The Wampanoag called it hopness. The Iroquois called it a hopinamine. The Algonquin called it apin. English colonists, desperate and starving, called it groundnut, and it kept them alive. This is Apios americana, the American groundnut, a perennial legume native to river valleys and forest edges from Quebec to Florida, from the Atlantic coast to the Great Plains. The plant climbs through corn stalks and wraps around trees, reaching 8 to 10 feet high. In summer, it blooms with deep maroon flowers that smell of cinnamon and roses. But the treasure is invisible, hidden beneath the soil. Each tuber stores 16 to 17% protein, triple what a potato offers. More calcium than milk, more iron than spinach. A complete amino acid profile that rivals meat. And it does something potatoes cannot. It heals the earth. Groundnut is a legume. While corn and wheat extract nitrogen from the soil, groundnut pulls it from the air and deposits it back into exhausted earth. Indigenous farmers knew this. They planted it alongside corn deliberately, not just for food, but to restore what corn took away. This was regenerative agriculture 3,000 years before we coined the term. The cultivation method was elegant. In spring, farmers planted a single tuber near the base of a corn stalk. The vine climbed upward, following the corn toward the sun. By autumn, that single tuber had multiplied into 15 or 20 new ones, strung together underground like beads on a string. Harvest what you needed, leave the rest in the ground. Next spring, the vine returned on its own, thicker, stronger, more abundant. One planting, forever harvests. The Wampanoag told a story about groundnut. They said it was a gift from the Creator, placed along riverbanks so that even when crops failed, people would never starve. The tubers could be eaten raw, crisp, and slightly sweet like water chestnuts, or boiled until soft with a flavor somewhere between potato and chestnut, or dried into flour that lasted through winter. They were survival itself, not luxury. Foundation. By the time European explorers arrived in the early 1600s, groundnut was woven into the food systems of dozens of indigenous nations. From the Great Lakes to the Carolinas, from the Atlantic shore to the Mississippi River, hopness was insurance against famine. Then came contact. In 1602, English explorer Bartholomew Gosnold landed on Cape Cod. His crew was starving. The Wampanoag fed them groundnut. Gosnold wrote in his journal that the tubers were as good as potatoes and grew in great abundance. In 1605, French explorer Samuel de Champlain documented indigenous people harvesting groundnut along the Massachusetts coast. He tasted it. He filled his ship's hold with tubers and sailed back to France, hoping to cultivate it in Europe. In 1607, Jamestown colonists arrived in Virginia with European seed, wheat, barley, peas. Within months, their crops failed. The soil was wrong, the climate was wrong, they were dying. The Powhatan people showed them groundnut. Captain John Smith later wrote that without these roots, they all would have perished. By 1621, when Wampanoag leaders sat with English settlers at Plymouth for the harvest feast we now call Thanksgiving, groundnut was almost certainly on that table. Not as a side dish, as survival itself. Colonial records from this period are filled with references to groundnut as emergency food. One settler wrote in 1654 that in times of want they lived entirely on these roots for weeks at a time. The English owed their lives to a crop they had never seen before, a crop that required no European knowledge, no plowing, no fertilizer, a crop that simply knew how to feed people when everything else failed. Then we built a national holiday around turkey and corn, and we forgot the plant that made survival possible. The erasure did not happen overnight. It happened slowly, methodically, as colonial agriculture replaced indigenous systems. By the 1700s, European settlers had established farms across New England. They brought their own crops, wheat, oats, potatoes, crops that grew in neat rows, crops that ripened on schedule, crops that could be measured, taxed, and sold in markets. Groundnut did not fit that system. It climbed. It spread. Its tubers formed at different depths and matured at different times. You could not harvest it with a plow. You had to dig carefully by hand, following the underground chain of beads. Miss one fragment and the next year a full patch would sprout in the same spot. For indigenous farmers who understood perennial systems, this was a feature. For colonial agriculture built on annual monoculture, it was a problem. Groundnut could not be controlled. By the 1800s, American agriculture was industrializing. The mechanical reaper revolutionized wheat harvests. The steel plow broke prairie sod. Railroads carried grain to distant markets. Farms grew larger, more specialized, and more dependent on machinery. Groundnut had no place in that world. A potato harvester could rip through an acre in hours, pulling uniform tubers from uniform depths. But groundnut tubers varied wildly. Some were as small as marbles, others as large as eggs, scattered along roots that twisted through the soil like veins. Half the harvest would be left behind, broken, lost. And there was another problem. Groundnut is perennial. Plant it once and it returns forever, producing more food each year without replanting and without purchased seed. You cannot patent a perennial. You cannot sell seed every spring to farmers who already have it growing in their fields. You cannot spray it with fertilizers it does not need or pesticides for diseases it does not get. Farmers who grow groundnut do not need corporations. And that made it dangerous. By the mid-1800s, groundnut was disappearing from American farms. Not because it failed, because the system could not profit from it. Agricultural journals called it unsuitable for commercial production. Government extension agents recommended potatoes instead, a crop that required annual seed purchases, chemical fertilizers, and pest control. Potatoes fit the system. Groundnut challenged it. Settlers began calling groundnut a weed, something wild, uncivilized, a relic of primitive indigenous agriculture. The vine that had saved their ancestors from starvation became an embarrassment. By 1900, groundnut had vanished from every major farm in North America. It survived only in the wild, along riverbanks, in forest edges, in forgotten corners, where no one farmed. Waiting. But history was about to prove what we had thrown away. In 1845, potato blight swept across Europe. Ireland lost its entire crop. Over 1 million people starved to death. Another million fled the country. Groundnut, growing wild in American forests, never got sick. It was resistant to most pests and diseases. It could have fed Ireland through the famine, but no one was cultivating it anymore. In the 1930s, the Dust Bowl destroyed millions of acres of American farmland. Wheat fields turned to desert, farmers went bankrupt, families starved. Groundnut, with its deep roots and nitrogen-fixing abilities, could have stabilized that soil. It could have provided protein when wheat failed, but we had already erased it. During World War II, when food shortages struck across Europe and North America, governments printed emergency survival guides listing wild edibles. Groundnut appeared on those lists, a ghost from the past, still growing along riverbanks, still waiting to feed people. But an entire generation had forgotten how to recognize it, how to harvest it, and how to cook it. The knowledge was gone. The crop that had survived 3,000 years of indigenous cultivation disappeared in less than 2 centuries of industrial agriculture, not because it failed, because it succeeded without permission. But groundnut, like all perennials, is patient. In the 1980s, a researcher named Dr. William Blackman at Louisiana State University was studying native food crops. He was searching for high-protein plants that could grow in poor soils with minimal water. He found groundnut growing wild along the Mississippi River. He tested it. 16 to 17% protein, complete amino acid profile, thrives in swamps and sandy soils, survives floods and droughts, fixes nitrogen. Perennial. He wrote in his report that this may be the most overlooked food crop in North American history. Blackman began breeding groundnut for larger tubers and earlier harvests. He selected varieties that produced fist-sized tubers in a single season instead of requiring 3 years to mature. His work proved what indigenous farmers had known for millennia. Groundnut was not a primitive relic, it was a survival crop built for hardship. In 2003, Japanese researchers confirmed groundnut could thrive in degraded soils with no irrigation. In 2017, a USDA study called it a high-protein crop with untapped potential for temperate climates. By 2010, permaculture farmers across North America were planting groundnut in food forests. Seed savers were collecting wild varieties from ancestral lands. A Canadian seed company called Cultivariable began selling improved cultivars bred from Blackman's research. And something deeper was happening. Wampanoag educators began teaching groundnut cultivation in tribal schools. Elders remembered their grandparents harvesting hopness in autumn, roasting the tubers over fires like chestnuts. This wasn't rediscovery, it was reclamation. The knowledge was never lost, it was stolen, buried, erased from textbooks and farm systems and national memory. Now it's returning to the hands that cultivated it for 3,000 years. Today, climate change is rewriting the rules of agriculture. Potatoes need 20 inches of rain annually. Wheat needs 15. Corn needs 30. Groundnut thrives on 10. It grows in swamps and sandy soils, flood zones and drought zones, heat and cold. Its roots reach 6 feet deep, tapping water reserves other crops can't touch. It fixes nitrogen, healing soil that industrial farming has destroyed. As temperatures rise and water vanishes, as droughts kill wheat and floods drown corn, groundnut remains. Perennial, resilient, waiting. The crop we called backward may be the future of food security. Scientists are now asking the question indigenous farmers answered 3,000 years ago, what survives when everything else fails? The answer has been growing along riverbanks this entire time. Groundnut teaches what empires want buried. Abundance does not require control. Perennials return without permission. They do not need seed purchases, chemical inputs, corporate approval. They adapt, persist, outlast. The fourth sister was never lost. She has been underground this whole time, holding protein, holding nitrogen, holding the memory of what survival looks like. All we have to do is remember her name. We didn't lose the groundnut. We chose to forget it. We replaced abundance with dependence, resilience with control, indigenous wisdom with industrial monoculture. But the vine still grows wild. Along the edges of rivers, in forests where no one farms, in the spaces we left empty when we cleared the land, waiting for hands willing to dig. Subscribe to Nature Lost Vault and hit the bell. Every like and every share preserves what they tried to erase. The knowledge lives in the soil, in every wild patch, in every escaped tuber, in every seed saved by those who refuse to forget. The fourth sister is calling us back to the table.